Have you ever looked back at your relationship history, or maybe your closest friendships, and noticed a totally bizarre, almost unbelievable pattern? You know, the kind where the names and faces change, but that overwhelming, heavy atmosphere, it stays exactly the same? Well, today in this explainer, we're unpacking a really fascinating piece of source material that dives deep into the hidden architecture of some of our absolute messiest human bonds. It's an exploration of a specific astrological and psychological text called The Magnetic Drought of Rahu in the 8th House. And look, whether you're deeply versed in these concepts or you're just trying to figure out your own chaotic relationship patterns, the psychological blueprint we're about to decode is going to completely change how you view emotional attachment. Seriously, it's a real game changer. So let me ask you directly. Why do you repeatedly attract intense people and exhausting drama? I really want you to think about it. You might consider yourself a pretty grounded, rational person, right? Yet somehow you continually find yourself standing dead center in someone else's emotional hurricane. You pour your time, your focus, and your entire heart into these connections only to wind up utterly depleted, while the other person, they actually seem to feed off the chaos. Before we reveal the specific culprit our source material points to, hold on to that feeling of exhaustion for a second, because that draining, cyclical drama, it isn't just bad luck. According to the text, it is a highly specific, deeply ingrained pattern. Okay, let's dive into this. The source material pins this exact phenomenon on an astrological placement known as Rahu in the 8th house. Now, to break it down simply, the text defines this as a sort of cosmic or psychological blueprint where intense people drain your energy specifically through obsession and drama. And we're not talking about someone just occasionally having a bad day here. No, this is a sustained, almost magnetic pull toward individuals whose very presence in your life demands an overwhelming amount of your mental bandwidth. The text lays out a clear framework, basically saying this placement operates like a giant vacuum. It sucks you into these high-stakes emotional situations that eventually just leave you completely empty. So, the source material actually breaks the progression of these relationships down into distinct stages. First up is phase 1, the magnetic attraction. The text explicitly points out that you repeatedly attract emotionally intense people who feel magnetic but unstable. And honestly, that juxtaposition is everything. It's literally a moth to a flame dynamic, because the instability, it isn't a red flag at first. Actually, scratch that. The instability is basically part of the magnetism. You're drawn to their depth, their passion, or, this perceived sense of vulnerability they project. The source material highlights this huge inherent contradiction. They pull you in with this irresistible gravity, but the ground beneath them is entirely fractured. And because of that intense magnetism, these relationships always begin with pure fascination. The text makes it incredibly clear that this initial illusion feels so profound and real. You might catch yourself thinking, wow, I've literally never met anyone who understands me on this level. Or, this person is just so complex and fascinating. But here's the thing. This pure fascination is the bait. It establishes an illusion of a destined, meant-to-be connection, which completely masks the reality of the instability lurking just under the surface. You're captivated, which is exactly what makes what happens next so incredibly disorienting. Which brings us to the messy, chaotic middle stage. Phase 2, cycles of obsession. And this brilliantly illustrates the exact chronological loop detailed in the source. It's a vicious cycle. We start at step 1, fascination, but that almost inevitably slides right into step 2, psychological confusion. The text really emphasizes this transition. Suddenly, the exact quirks that were charming become perplexing. The narrative shifts. Then, boom, we hit step 3, emotional entanglement. You try to solve their confusion, and in doing so, you get deeply, deeply intertwined with their issues. The attachment becomes practically impossible to break. And finally, step 4, withdrawal. After that entanglement peaks, there's this sudden period of pulling away or creating distance, which just creates this awful emotional whiplash. During this cycle of obsession, the source text notes that these partners might start throwing some very specific, overwhelming traits your way. We're talking controlling behavior, massive dramatic reactions, totally unpredictable actions, secrets and hidden motives bubbling up out of nowhere. You can instantly feel the mental drain and the chaos they're describing, right? It's an absolute barrage of instability. When someone's intentions are that unclear and their reactions are explosive, your nervous system is essentially forced to stay on high alert 24/7. Now, you might be wondering, why on earth do we stay in this? Well, the text gives us a pretty sobering answer. Weak emotional boundaries lead to over-involvement in their chaos. And this is the absolute crux of the issue.
The source material isn't just pointing the finger at the intense people you attract, it's putting a huge spotlight on your side of the dynamic too. When your emotional boundaries are porous, you soak up their drama like a sponge. Their emergency literally becomes your emergency. Their unpredictability becomes the absolute center of your universe, dragging you deeper and deeper into a world you have zero control over. The immediate result of this boundary collapse is feeling totally mentally drained after deep conversations or emotionally charged interactions. I really want to highlight this because it perfectly validates the experience described in the text. You know exactly that feeling. You spend 3 hours on the phone trying to untangle their latest massive crisis, and when you finally hang up, you feel like you've just run a marathon. Meanwhile, they probably feel perfectly fine. The text identifies this profound mental depletion as a huge hallmark of this exact placement and dynamic. But don't worry, the source material does build toward a resolution. Let's look at how we break the cycle in phase 3, the core lesson. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the text breaks down the ultimate psychological trap. Basically, you might confuse emotional intensity with genuine compatibility or love. Just think about that for a second. When you're caught up in this pattern, you genuinely start to believe that the roller coaster, the super high highs and the terrifying lows, is what love is actually supposed to feel like. You end up mistaking a spike in your adrenaline and cortisol for a genuine, steady, healthy compatibility. The source material is desperately urging us to separate the volume of the emotion from the actual quality of the connection. And that brings us to the most powerful, hard-hitting takeaway from the text. The lesson often comes through realizing when involvement becomes psychological dependency rather than connection. Let that sink in. This is the ultimate resolution to the Rahu in the 8th house dilemma. It's the profound realization that being tangled up in someone else's unending drama, it isn't a badge of honor, and it sure isn't true intimacy. It is a dependency. You become dependent on fixing them, and they become dependent on draining you. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final, memorable question straight from our source text today. Look at the relationships in your life right now, especially the ones that exhaust you the absolute most, and ask yourself, are you building a true connection, or are you just feeding a psychological dependency? Recognizing the difference between those two things is the very first step in reclaiming your energy, rebuilding your emotional boundaries, and finally stepping off that roller coaster for good. Keep this question with you and really start examining where your energy is going.